Hello and welcome to BYJU'S IAS. Let's get started with the analysis of today's The Hindu newspaper, beginning with a news item on page number 1 of the Delhi edition of The Hindu, relevant for GS paper 2 as well as 3. Farmers firm on Delhi march against centre's farm laws. Let's understand this newspaper article in slight detail and try and understand why are farmers protesting against these three farm acts and why are few state governments also against these laws. To look at it, let's understand the background. Three acts were passed, which is what we call three farm acts, and these are the three acts. What act number 1 does, it reduces the interstate barriers for farmers to sell their agricultural produce. I'll repeat, this act, what it does, it reduces the barriers in interstate trade and commerce for farmers so that farmers are seamlessly allowed to sell their agricultural produce. But how? What this act does, it allows the farmers to trade outside the APMC mandis or APMC markets, agricultural produce market committees. What this act does, it allows trading outside the APMC markets. Before this law, if I am a farmer, I could only sell my produce in the APMC mandis. Although as a farmer, I could sell outside these mandis as well, but it was very easy for me to sell in these mandis because it was easy for me to reach to these mandis. Otherwise, transportation cost would also increase if I had to sell my farm produce outside of these APMC mandis. So basically, even before this law, as a farmer, I could sell my produce outside the APMC mandis, but it was problematic, it was cumbersome. At the same time, I had to pay cess or fee to the state government, and only after that I could sell my produce outside the APMC markets. What this act does, it allows big retailers, corporates to do business directly with the farmer. So what it will do, it will create a competitive environment where farmers will have the choice to decide whom to sell and at what price. So basically what this act does, it creates something called open market system. How an open market system is created? Prior to this law, if I am a farmer, I have to sell my produce and I have to sell my produce in these APMC mandis only. Middlemen would play a very important role. So farmers could not get the good price of their produce because middlemen would pocket the profit. Now these big retailers, corporates, what they can do, they can directly get in touch with the farmers and sell produce directly to these retailers and the corporates. So basically what will happen, an open market system will be created and these middlemen would be isolated. That is what this act number 1 tries to achieve. What about act number 2? This act, what it does, it promotes contract farming. But contract farming, is this something new in India? No. So what does this act do? This act, what it does, it creates a national framework for this contract farming. What is this national framework for contract farming? Let's say, for example, here is a farmer. What this farmer can do, he can strike a deal directly with food processing industries, for example, directly with companies, for example, directly with exporters, for example. To give you a better idea, let's say, for example, there is PepsiCo, and why I have cited the example of PepsiCo, I'll tell you slightly later. This farmer directly signs a deal with PepsiCo, let's say, for example, for potatoes. Even before harvesting these potatoes, farmers would sign a deal with PepsiCo and would agree upon a price, a mutually agreed upon price. That means even before the harvesting of potato crops, the price at which PepsiCo will buy potato will be mutually agreed upon, that too before harvesting. This is what we call contract farming. And what this Act number 2 does, it facilitates contract farming, creates a national framework for contract farming. And what is this Act number 3? Essential Commodities Amendment Act of 2020. What this act does, it pulls out or removes what? Cereals, pulses, potatoes, onions, edible oil seeds from the list of essential commodities. But what is this Essential Commodities Act basically? The central government, if it is satisfied that it is necessary to do so, that too in public interest, what the central government can do, it can notify that this particular commodity is an essential commodity. And once this particular commodity, let's say for example onions, have been notified as essential commodities, then what the government has the power, the government can control production, supply, and the distribution of this essential commodity. And the government can also impose stock limits. This is very important for you to understand. Let me give you an example. For example, recently the prices of onions have gone up. Several states, what they showed, that onions were selling higher than 100 rupees per kg, which basically means the cost of onions in the market increases, which basically means it has an impact on inflation as well. When the price of a commodity increases, what happens? Hoarders and the black marketers, they become hyperactive. How? Let's say for example, if the onion prices have gone up, what these hoarders will do, they will keep quintals, hundreds and hundreds of quintals of onions in their stocks, and they will not release these onions in the market, which basically means that there is a supply shock. That means the supply of onions in the market is less, but the demand is high. When there is a mismatch between the demand and the supply, what will happen? The price of onions will increase. And this is what leads to inflation as well. But if onions are notified as essential commodities, then what the government can do, it can impose stock limits. And when stock limits are imposed, then these hoarders and black marketers, action against them can be taken by the government. But what this act does, it pulls out cereals, pulses, potatoes, onions, edible oil seeds from the list of essential commodities, which basically means the government will not now impose any restriction on the production, supply, and the distribution of these commodities, which basically means there will be no limit on these stocks as well. So how is this Amendment Act going to benefit? Let me tell you how. Let's say, for example, we have a private player. We have a private company, an exporter, for example. This private player, what he does, he invests. Where? In value chain. What is this value chain? For example, cold storage. Cold storage facilities are developed by this private player where he invests large amounts of money in setting up these value chains. And this private player, what he does, he stores a large quantity of onions in these cold storage. This is just to give you an example, a simplistic explanation. This private player invests a lot of money in setting up of this value chain, for example, a cold storage, and then stores in large quantities onions. Now, if these onions are notified as essential commodities, which means limits can be imposed on these stocks of onions as well, then why would this private player invest in setting up of these value chain? That is why the central government decided, the parliament decided in its wisdom, that let's pull out cereals, edible oil seeds, potatoes, pulses, onions from the list of essential commodities, which basically means more and more private players, what they will now do, they will invest in setting up these value chains. But if these are the benefits of these three farm laws, Then why are the states protesting and why are the farmers protesting? Let's take the example of farmers. Why are farmers protesting? Let's look at the reason number one. Farmers, particularly in Punjab, Haryana, they have mostly benefited from Green Revolution. They have benefited from these APMC markets as well. And they have benefited from MSP, minimum support price. What is this minimum support price? Let's say, for example, wheat, maize, cotton, for example. I am a farmer. I want to produce wheat, but there is volatility in the market. I don't know tomorrow when I will harvest my crop whether I will get the best price for my produce or not. Because there is price fluctuation, there is uncertainty. Maybe the monsoon would fail. Then what will happen to me? I'm a farmer. In that case, the government announces minimum support price. Even before the farmer sows his crop, he gets an idea that even if market is bad, monsoon is bad, whatever may be the situation, this is the minimum price that I will get for my produce. And the government can buy my produce at this minimum support price. So farmers in Punjab, Haryana, and in many other parts of this country, they have benefited immensely because of this minimum support price, which is like an insurance to these farmers. But when these three acts were passed, when we are saying that the farmers can directly sell their produce to corporates, to retailers, to exporters, the law is not clear whether these farmers can sell at MSP or higher than MSP price, which basically means that this act is silent on MSP. Number one, whether MSP will continue or not, farmers do not know. And at the same time, when these big corporates, retailers, they will buy these farm produce directly from the farmers, do they have to pay the price which is higher than MSP or at MSP? Or will farmers be forced to sell their produce below MSP? That's concern number one, because there is no clarity on the minimum support price. There is issue number two. We know private companies are profit oriented, and there is no harm in that as well. They are meant to be profit oriented. But farmers fear that these big companies, what they will do, they will bind these farmers in unfavorable contracts. And these farmers will be helpless in case there is a legal battle. And to explain this point, let me give you the example from the state of Gujarat. In the state of Gujarat, PepsiCo, that is why I told you, I'll tell you why I took the example of PepsiCo, but slightly later. PepsiCo, what it did, it filed a case against 4 Gujarat farmers. Why? Because these Gujarat farmers, what they were doing, they were cultivating FC5 potato variety. So what is harm in cultivating FC5 potato variety? The harm is PepsiCo is saying that these farmers, they were under the exclusive contract of cultivating this potato variety exclusively for PepsiCo. And since this exclusivity has been violated by the farmers, that is why PepsiCo is seeking damages of 10 million rupees from these 4 Gujarat farmers. This FC5 potato variety, it basically has low moisture content. And because of this low moisture content, it is very suitable for making snacks. For example, Lay's. That is why farmers, they fear that these big companies like PepsiCo, if they are directly allowed to trade with the farmers, what will happen? These big companies, they will bind these farmers in unfavorable contracts. And at the same time, the language of these contracts would also be difficult for these small farmers to understand. And if there is a legal battle, ultimately farmers would be at a disadvantage and these big retailers, corporates and companies would be at an advantage. Then there is a third issue. This act, what it does, I told you that farmers are now free to sell their produce outside the APMC mandis as well. This is where the third issue comes. If you are promoting trade outside of these APMC mandis, then what will happen? The significance of these APMC mandis will reduce. This is where the state's opposition comes into picture. This is where the state governments are protesting. Why? States right now, they can levy fee on the transactions done in APMC mandis. And if farmers are allowed to sell their produce outside of these APMC mandis, this is where the state governments will lose their revenue. And there are various calculations done that close to 1500 to 2000 crore would be lost by state governments in Punjab and Haryana if the farmers are allowed to sell their produce outside of these APMC mandis. The state governments are also protesting because they believe or they allege that these three farm acts are basically unconstitutional. They violate the spirit of federalism, which is part of the basic structure of Indian Constitution. How? The state governments say that agriculture basically is a state subject. And when agriculture is a state subject, then all these three laws should have been passed by the state legislatures. Parliament does not have the mandate, does not have the jurisdiction to pass such laws because agriculture is in the state list. That is why if you look at the distribution of powers, entry number 26 in list 2, which is a state list, it refers to trade and commerce within the state. So this is the prerogative of the state legislature. Entry 27 of state list talks about production, supply and distribution of goods, which is under the domain of the state legislature. Entry 28 talks about markets and fairs. By looking at these three entries, all these three farm laws are basically unconstitutional because Parliament is encroaching into the legitimate domain of the state legislature. That is why the state governments are saying that the Parliament has violated and breached the constitutional distribution of powers. It is because of these three entries, it is because of these three subjects that intrastate marketing in agriculture was always considered to be within the legitimate domain of the state legislature. That is why many people saw that Parliament passing such laws is basically an extraordinary step. Are these three laws unconstitutional? Maybe not. How? For this purpose, what the central government has done, it has invoked entry 33 in the concurrent list. And Constitution says entry 26 and 27 are subject to provisions of entry 33 in the concurrent list. That means, yes, the state legislature can make laws on trade and commerce within the state, on production, supply and distribution of goods. Yes, state legislature can make laws, but subject to entry 33 in the concurrent list. What is entry 33 of list 3 or concurrent list? Trade and commerce, production, supply and distribution of what? Those products of any industry where the control of such industry by the union is declared by Parliament by law to be expedient in public interest, which means any product which the central government declares or any industry which the central government declares that it is in public interest, that Parliament should make law on these things, then Parliament becomes empowered to make such law. That means if state legislatures are empowered to make laws on trade and commerce within the state, on production, supply and distribution of goods, but both these items in the state list are subject to entry 33 in the concurrent list. But you need to understand that there is something more to it. This entry 33 of concurrent list was not part of the original constitution. This was inserted to the constitution by Third Constitutional Amendment Act. Original constitution talked about Article 369. What is Article 369? Temporary power was given to the Parliament. That dear Parliament, you have the power, but a temporary power that you can make law on some matters mentioned in the state list, but only for a period of 5 years? And which are these matters on which the parliament has the power to make law for a temporary period of 5 years? These are the matters: trade and commerce within a state, and that too in production, supply, and distribution of cotton, textiles, raw cotton, foodstuff, iron, steel, mica. That means original constitution only talked about that temporary power should be given to the parliament to make a law on these items, but this power should be valid only for 5 years. Why for 5 years? Because at that point in time we were facing acute shortage of food stuff, and that is why this temporary power was given to the parliament, which means the constitution makers thought that after 5 years the condition would stabilize, the agrarian problems would be resolved, the scarcity in our food produce would also be taken care of. That means after 5 years, Parliament should not be empowered to make laws on these subjects, but state legislatures should be in a position to make laws on these subjects. This entry 33 was invoked by the Parliament, and by invoking this entry 33, these laws were made by the Parliament, which many people argue goes against the spirit of federalism, because these are within the legitimate domain of state legislature. So when these laws will be challenged before the Supreme Court, because many people have filed cases before the Supreme Court, state governments have also decided to file case in the Supreme Court challenging the constitutional validity of these three farm acts. But are these three farm acts constitutional? If we look at Union of India versus H.S. Dillon 1972 case, any parliamentary law can be challenged in the Supreme Court, but only on two grounds. Ground number one, if this law violates fundamental rights enshrined under Part 3 of the Constitution. That means on this ground, the parliamentary law can be challenged in the Supreme Court. And ground number two, if Parliament has passed any law, but it is proven in the Supreme Court that this was within the legitimate domain of state legislature. That means Parliament did not have the power to legislate on this subject because this subject was under the control of state legislature. If a law has been passed by the Parliament, but Parliament did not have the competence to pass such a law because this law could have been only passed by the state legislature. On this ground, this particular parliamentary law can be challenged in the Supreme Court. But the bigger problem is burden of proof. And this is where we need to talk about presumption of constitutionality. What is this presumption of constitutionality? Whenever any law is challenged before the Supreme Court presumes that this law is constitutional. It is for the petitioner to prove that this law is unconstitutional. That means if tomorrow the state governments are challenging the constitutionality of these three farm acts before the Supreme Court will first presume that these farm acts are constitutional. It is for the states to prove that these laws are unconstitutional, which means the burden of proof is on the states. And when the burden of proof is on states, it becomes very difficult for the states to convince the judiciary that these laws are unconstitutional. These are the legal challenges that the Supreme Court will have to grapple with when the Supreme Court will hear these cases. So what is the newspaper article talking about? Newspaper article says, farmers are firm on Delhi march against centre's farm laws. And to understand why farmers are protesting, why the state governments are protesting, this is the background that you need to know. And that is all that you need to know from this newspaper article. Now let's look at another news on page number 1 of the Delhi edition of the Hindu, relevant for GS paper 2. In a move that will have far-reaching impact, the government has decided to bring OTT or over-the-top platforms and be regulated by the Ministry of Information and Broadcasting. Let's understand this newspaper article in slight detail. If you look at print media, for example, the newspapers, Print media is regulated by Press Council of India. This Press Council of India is basically a statutory body created by the parliamentary law. If we look at electronic media or electronic news channels, electronic media is regulated by National Broadcasting Authority. But this National Broadcasting Authority is basically the body of news channels themselves. So basically, electronic news channels are self-regulated in India, regulated by the news channels themselves. If we look at films, movies, for example, they are regulated by CBFC, Central Board for Film Certification. This is normally referred to as a censor board. Although it is not a censor board, it is only a film certification board, Central Board for Film Certification. That means what CBFC does, when it watches a movie, it certifies whether this movie can be watched by adults only, or whether this movie can be watched by children as well, whether parental guidance is recommended or not. And based on that, certificates are issued to various movies and films. Certificates such as this movie can be watched by universal audience, universal certificate. A certificate, that means only people above the age of 18 can watch this movie. When it comes to advertising in India, advertising is regulated by ASCI, which is Advertising Standards Council of India. TV programming, for example, Ekta Kapoor's soaps. TV programming is regulated by Cable Networks Regulation Act, which basically means whatever the content, whether it is advertising, whether it is TV programming, whether it is print media or electronic media or movies for that matter, there is some form of regulation. Whether this regulation is self-regulation or by a statutory body or any other form, every other form of content is regulated in India. But these OTT platforms, they were unregulated as of now. Nobody was regulating them. But first up, what are these OTT platforms or over-the-top platforms? These are basically audio and video hosting and streaming services. Basically, these OTT platforms, famous OTT platforms such as Netflix, Amazon Prime, Alt Balaji, they initially started off as content hosting platforms. What is this content hosting platform? For example, Yash Raj Films, Red Chillies Entertainment, Dharma Productions, Vishesh Films, these production houses would make movies or would make shows, and Netflix, Amazon Prime, Alt Balaji, they will only host these contents on its platform. But over a period of time, these OTT platforms, what they did, they branched out into production as well as the release of movies, web series, feature films, for example. Before this order was issued by the President of India, there were no laws or rules governing or regulating these OTT platforms because this was relatively new medium of entertainment. Because unlike television, print or radio, which follow guidelines released by the government, these OTT platforms, they had little or no regulation. No regulation on the choice of content they offered, on the subscription rates that they have, on the certification for adult movies or not, nothing. They were not regulated. And that is why some people felt that there is a need to regulate these OTT platforms. What was the need? Allegation is that soft pornographic content is streamed and played on these platforms, which is unethical. Allegation also is that it goes against the sovereignty of the nation because there are some shows which are referring to Kashmir as Indian occupied Kashmir. Some say vulgar, abusive content is played on these platforms. Allegation also is that children are engaged in criminal activities. The content on these OTT platforms, it objectifies women. That is why there is a need for regulation. For example, Sacred Games, one of the popular web series directed by Anurag Kashyap, it was accused of promoting porn. It was accused of streaming soft porn content. There were some mentions against Rajiv Gandhi and the Bofors scam as well. That is why there was a lot of controversy surrounding sacred games. Then there was another Netflix show, Leela, which some people allege is promoting Hindu phobia. Basic allegation is that these OTT platforms, since they are unregulated, not regulated right now, majority of these programs, they depict anti-Hindu plot narratives. So in one single stroke, what the government has done, virtually all content which is available on the internet, whether it is news, opinions, web series, all of them are now under the control of government monitoring under the ambit of Ministry of Information and Broadcasting, which basically means Ministry of Information and Broadcasting will create policies, and these policies will dictate what is to be shown on these platforms, what is to be uploaded online, what should not be uploaded online. What is there a need? The need is, let's say, for example, I have to start a TV channel, let's say a news channel. I have to first apply for a license from the government. Without this license, I cannot start a news channel. But because of these OTT platforms, what I can do or what I could have done, I could just have created an app, produced my own content. This can be news programs, current affairs programs, opinions, vlogs, and ultimately I would be the news provider to the people of this country. So those who support this move of the government, they say if a TV news channel needs a license for playing current affairs programs, news, opinions, vlogs on OTT platforms, you also should need a license. Otherwise, you will pick out content which goes against the sovereignty of the nation, and this is something which cannot be tolerated. But there are some critics who say that this goes against free speech, which is a fundamental guarantee under Article 19, Clause 1, Clause A of the Constitution. They say if news channels are self-regulated, these OTT platforms also should be self-regulated. Self-regulated in the sense, in January 2019, 8 OTT platforms, what they did, they came together and they created a self-regulatory code. And in that self-regulatory code, they mentioned 5 types of content that they will not stream. They clearly mentioned that they will not promote any story which goes against the sovereignty of India. They will not promote any story which promotes child pornography in India. They will not promote any story which widens the gulf between the religious communities in India. That means close to 8 OTT platforms last year itself, they decided to come together and abide by a strict code through which they wanted to self-regulate themselves. Just like News Broadcasters Association, it self-regulates TV news channels. But the government rejected this code, and now the government has decided that all these OTT platforms will come under the ambit of Ministry of Information and Broadcasting. Critics also say that there was no need to use this excuse that OTT platforms, they are streaming content which goes against the sovereignty of India. Just for this, you need not have imposed censorship on OTT platforms. Why? Because you already have Section 69 capital A of Information Technology Act. And it is this Section 69 capital A which is what we call Internet Kill Switch. What is this Internet Kill Switch? The central government can at any point in time invoke Section 69 capital A of Information Technology Act 2000, and it can stop the broadcast of any program. It can stop the content on any platform if that content goes against the sovereignty of the nation, if that platform goes against the sovereignty of the nation. And that is how TikTok was banned in India. That is how 59 Chinese apps initially were banned by the central government by invoking the same Section 69 capital A of Information Technology Act. Long story short, what are we trying to understand from this newspaper article? Number one, there are OTT platforms. Which are these OTT platforms? Hotstar, Netflix, Amazon Prime, Alt Balaji, Voot, so on and so forth. As of now, they were unregulated. They were not regulated at all. But now they have been brought under the ambit of Ministry of Information and Broadcasting, which means some people support this move. Why? Because they say if news channels can be regulated, if television soaps can be regulated, if print media can be regulated, why not these OTT platforms? But there are others who say that these OTT platforms should have been allowed to self-regulate themselves, just like TV news channels. They should not come under the ambit of Information and Broadcasting Ministry. Because even if there is a content which is played and streamed out on these OTT platforms, which goes against the sovereignty, integrity of the nation, for that you always have an internet kill switch, which is Section 69 capital A of Information Technology Act. That is what you need to understand from this newspaper article. Now let's look at editorials and columns from today's newspaper. Number one, myths and the reality of election forecasts. To understand this column, first we need to understand what is an opinion poll, then what is an exit poll, and what is a post poll. There is a difference. Before the voting begins, people are asked, whom are you going to vote for? So basically, public opinion. Public opinion is sought. Pollsters, various organizations, they approach the people, ask the people, what are the grounds on the basis of which you want this party to win and that party to lose? What are the issues on the basis of which you will decide which candidate to vote for, which candidate to vote against? Basically, opinion poll. That means opinion poll is before the actual voting. Before the actual voting, we ask people, whom are you going to vote for? That's what we call an opinion poll. Opinion polls are banned during the period of election silence. What is this period of election silence? 48 hours before the last person has cast his vote. Let's say, for example, the voting ends 8 p.m. 48 hours prior to 8 p.m. There should be no publishing, no broadcasting of the findings of this opinion poll. That means the findings, the results of these opinion polls cannot be published, cannot be broadcast during the period of election silence. But before that, yes, they can be published, yes, they can be broadcast. But so far as exit polls and post polls are concerned, there is a blanket ban on them. That means unless and until the entire voting is over, you cannot publish and broadcast the findings of exit poll and post poll. Then what is the difference between exit poll and opinion poll? Let's say, for example, this is a 5-phase election. Phase 1, Phase 2, Phase 3, Phase 4, Phase 5. Before the first phase of voting, before the period of election silence, you can broadcast the findings of opinion poll. After the voting is over, then second phase will be after 5 days, for example. During this period, opinion poll results can be published, can be broadcast. That means during this entire election process, you can publish, broadcast the findings of these opinion polls subject to election silence. That means 48 hours before the end of voting, opinion poll results, findings cannot be broadcast, cannot be published. But exit polls, you cannot publish the findings of exit poll after first phase voting is over, after second phase voting is over, unless and until the last phase is over, unless and until the last person has cast his or her vote in the last phase of the election, you cannot publish the findings of exit poll and post poll. And what is this exit poll? Once the voter is exiting the polling booth, the organizations, the pollsters ask them, whom have you voted for? Which means opinion poll is, whom are you going to vote for? Exit poll is, just after the voter has exited a polling booth, Organizations, pollsters are asking them, whom have you voted for? Since this is considered to be slightly more accurate than opinion poll, and since exit poll findings can influence the minds of the voters, that is why there is a blanket ban on the publishing and broadcasting of the findings of exit poll. And what is post poll? Instead of asking the voter after he or she exits the polling booth, whom have you voted for? What organizations do? What pollsters do? They go to the houses of the voters, knock the doors of their house, and ask them, whom have you voted for? That means the only difference between an exit poll and post poll is that exit poll is conducted when the voter is exiting the polling booth, and post poll is done when the pollsters they knock the doors of the homes of these voters and ask them, whom have you voted for? There's a ban. Exit poll, post poll results cannot be published unless and until the last person has cast his vote in the last phase of the election. But opinion poll results can be published even during the election process, but not during the period of election silence. Globally, as well as in India, exit polls have come under sharp criticism. In the last US presidential elections, almost every exit poll predicted a win for Hillary Clinton, but Donald Trump emerged victorious. In the recently concluded US presidential elections, again, almost everyone predicted an easy win for Joe Biden, but it turned out a very close election. In India, almost every election exit poll predicted a comfortable victory for Atal Bihari Vajpayee in 2004 Lok Sabha elections, but that was not to be. Of late, however, there are two agencies, two organizations, two pollsters. One is today's Chanakya and the other is Access My India. They have been spot on with their predictions. This was the prediction of today's Chanakya for 2019 Lok Sabha elections. And look at the predictions and the actual results. It was predicted that BJP will win 300 plus minus 14 seats and BJP bagged close to 302 seats. Congress would bag 55 plus minus 9 seats and Congress was in a position to bag 52 seats. Accurate prediction. If you look at Access My India exit poll, Delhi exit poll, for example, the elections to Delhi Legislative Assembly, Access My India predicted Aam Aadmi Party would get 59 to 68 seats and it got 62. It had predicted that BJP will get in the range of 2 to 11 and BJP got 8. It had predicted accurately, which is not difficult to predict these days, that Congress would get 0 and it got 0. So Access My India exit poll was basically an exact poll. Similarly, Access My India Jharkhand exit poll. It predicted that JAM Alliance would win 38 to 50 seats and the actual result said 47. It predicted in its exit poll that BJP would win 22 to 32 seats and it bagged 25 seats. Not just seats, look at the vote share prediction. Access My India predicted 37% vote share for JMM Alliance and in reality it got 35.3. It was predicted that BJP vote share would be 34 and in reality it got 33.4. So basically this exit poll was an exact poll. But both these pollsters, today's Chanakya and Access My India, they predicted comfortable victory for Tejasvi Yadav or RJD-led alliance in the Bihar Assembly elections. Today's Chanakya in fact predicted a landslide win for Tejasvi Yadav, but ultimately the NDA stormed back to power. What this column talks about, it says it is difficult to analyze or comment on these exit polls because most of these pollsters, they do not tell us how do they collect the sample, whether they go for random sampling or how do they collect their samples, whether they go to the remote corners of the constituencies or not. But why this column becomes important for your examination? Women's participation in elections. How? When these pollsters, today's Chanakya, Access My India, or other organizations, when they conduct these exit polls or opinion polls, they do not sufficiently interview the women voters. What you need to understand for your examination is that number one, women's participation in election process has increased a lot. More and more women are coming out in large numbers and voting. In fact, the voting percentage amongst women is more than that of the men. That's one big takeaway that you have to take. That is very important for your examination in your essays or in your GS answers. This point can be very important. Now let's look at the practice questions, first for prelims and then for mains. Which of the following statement is or are correct? The Global New Car Assessment Program, Global NCAP, is a project of the Towards Zero Foundation, which is a UK registered charity. This statement is correct. Global NCAP's long-term aspiration is for a world free from road fatalities and serious injuries by 2025. This statement is wrong. Although yes, the long-term aspiration of global NCAP is for a world free from road and fatalities, but it has not suggested any time frame. So if by 2025 was removed from the statement, this statement was correct. But by adding 2025, this statement is wrong. No Indian car has ever bagged a 5-star rating in the global NCAP tests. This is also wrong because there are few cars, for example, XUV 300 by Mahindra, Tata's, Altroz, and Nexon. They have also bagged 5-star rating in these global NCAP tests. So which of these statements are correct? A, only one. What is the context? The context is Maruti Espresso, Grand i10, they have scored very poorly in these global NCAP crash tests. Let's look at another question. What is a biobubble? Biobubble is basically a safe and secure environment isolated from the outside world to minimize the risk of COVID-19 infection. What is the context? The context here is IPL is over, but in IPL, one important technology was used, and that is this biobubble. In simple terms, it's an environment which is sealed off from the outside world. Players, support staff, match officials, they are restricted to this specific space. And this specific space is called biobubble. Basically, what organizers do, they can cut off their physical interactions with the outside world, cut off physical interactions of the players, support staff, thus minimizing the risk of COVID-19 infection. Here is a player, first tested for COVID-19. Once the test is negative, then they are brought into this biobubble. And then when they are brought into this biobubble, they are quarantined here so that they are cut off in their physical interactions with the outside world, and ultimately the risk of COVID-19 infection is minimized. This is what a biobubble is. Let's look at question number 3. Consider the following statements about early Vedic age. Agriculture was prominent economic activity during the early Vedic age. This statement is wrong. Cattle was the chief identifier of wealth. This statement is correct. Iron was used in agriculture. No. But the question is asking you which of the above statements are incorrect. So statement 1 and 3 incorrect. C is the right answer. Why 1 is incorrect? Because not agriculture, pastoralism was the way of life in early Vedic period. Agriculture was only a secondary activity. Life was mostly nomadic during the early Vedic age. Statement 2 is correct because cattle was a source of wealth, but iron was used only after 600 BC. But why is this question asked? Look at the context. Pastoralism has been the most sustainable form of production, livelihood, and land use in most of the world's arid and semi-arid areas. And in fact, various organizations, including United Nations, has said that if we will promote pastoralism, we are going to meet the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. Prelims question 2020, Rajya Sabha has equal powers with Lok Sabha in amending the constitution, because a constitutional amendment bill under Article 368 shall have to be passed by both Lok Sabha as well as Rajya Sabha, that too separately. There is no concept of joint sitting of Indian Parliament when it comes to amendment to the constitution. Let's look at the mains based questions. Number one, sharing the wealth doesn't only mean giving it away to charity. It can also mean investing it so that the benefits of growth can be enjoyed by all. And smart, workable wealth taxes can make that happen at a time when the world needs to search for new solutions. Various countries, various individuals, organizations, they are demanding wealth taxes, more and more wealth taxes, so that the rich are taxed more, so that the money which is generated can be used to support those people who have suffered during this COVID-19 pandemic. And why charity is important here? Look at the context. Azim Premji, he has donated close to 22 crore rupees a day, which is about 7,904 crore in the last year, to emerge as the most generous Indian in financial year 2020. So if charity is in the news, charity, also wealth tax, together can go a long way in tackling the crisis of this pandemic. Question number two, there is a case to argue that the three Farm Acts have poor legal validity and may weaken federalism. Critically analyze. Please write answers to these questions and drop in your comments so that we can pick them up. That is it from our newspaper analysis for today. Thank you for being with us. Have a great day.